Travelers have always needed some place to stay on their journey, whether it was long or short. Facilities offering hospitality to travelers were part of most early civilizations. In Greco-Roman culture and in ancient Persia, hospitals for recuperation and rest were built at thermal baths. Japan's Nashiyama Onsen Kaiyukan, founded in the year 705, is the oldest hotel in the world. During the Middle Ages, various religious orders at monasteries and abbeys would offer accommodation for travelers on the road. Welcome to the Rediscover the Winds podcast, a podcast by the Fremont County Museums. With museums in Du Bois, Riverton, and Lander, the Fremont County Museum System is committed to collecting, preserving, and interpreting the stories of Fremont County and the Wind River area. The unique artifacts found at our museums relate the history of central Wyoming with information which, in many cases, can't be found anywhere else. With the Rediscover the Winds podcast, we hope to bring some of that history to you, wherever you are listening. Last episode, we looked at the history of hotels in Riverton. We explored the early hotels of the 1900s and investigated the influx of people to the area. We looked at factors that led to this population increase, including settlement, job opportunities, and the railroad. Additionally, we investigated the growth of tourism in the area, including interest in Yellowstone National Park, which greatly contributed to the growth of hotels and later motels in Riverton. This episode will continue with our theme of tourism and travel as we explore the story of Lander Valley hotels. The precursor to the modern hotel was the inn of medieval Europe. These would provide for the needs of travelers, including food and lodging, stabling, and fodder for the travelers' horses, and fresh horses for mail coaches. In colonial America, some taverns offered food and rooms. As the country grew and roads pushed west, inns catered to travelers on foot, horseback, or wagon. In more remote areas, roadhouses were established to serve stagecoach riders. Often crude and simple, they did at least offer a roof over one's head and food and drink. Tired travelers often had to share their bed with another person. There was often bedbugs and other vermin, and the food could be unpalatable. A colorful description of a roadhouse in southwestern Wyoming was given by Sir Richard Burton, a 19th century traveler. He described the early Hams Fork stage station with something less than a ringing endorsement. Quote, "The station was kept by an Irishman and a Scotsman, David Lewis. It was a disgrace. The squalor and filth were worse almost than the two other stage stations, Cold Springs and Rock Creek, which had called out horrors and which had always seemed to be the ne plus ultra of western discomfort. The shanty was made of dry stone piled up against a dwarf cliff to save back wall and ignored doors and windows. The flies, unequivocal sign of unclean living, darkened the table and covered everything put upon it. The furniture, which mainly consisted of different parts of wagons, was broken, and all in disorder. The walls were impure, the floor filthy. I could hardly look upon the scene without disgust." Conditions varied from roadhouse to roadhouse, of course. Mark Twain, in his book Roughing It, which was about his trip west via stagecoach, wrote, quote, "At the Green River Station, in Wyoming Territory, we had breakfast, hot biscuits, fresh antelope steaks, and coffee. The only decent meal we tasted between the United States and Great Salt Lake City, and the only one we were ever really thankful for." Hundreds of thousands of travelers crossed what would become Wyoming during the westward migration along the emigrant trails. There were no developed towns along this route other than military posts and trading posts at Fort Laramie and Bridger, but the immigrants along the trail slept in their wagons, in tents, or out in the open. As more Europeans and Americans pushed into Wyoming Territory and the West, rough roads for the U.S. Army, telegraph lines, mail delivery wagons, stagecoaches, and freight wagons were built. It was a long distance between places, especially for travelers riding stagecoaches from cities in the east to the growing cities in Utah, California, and Colorado. Stage stops, or roadhouses, were developed to offer at least some semblance of lodging and food for travelers, and a place for drivers to get fresh horses. Mark Twain again describes a typical Wyoming Territory station. Quote, "Each evening, the stage announces its approach to a way station by the driver blowing a bugle. The way station offers sparse comfort. The station buildings were long, low huts made of sun-dried, mud-colored bricks, laid up without mortar. Adobes, the Spaniards call these bricks. and Americans shortened it to dobies. The roofs, which had no slant to them worth speaking of, were thatched and then sodded or covered with a thick layer of earth, and from this sprang a pretty rank growth of weeds and grass. It was the first time we had ever seen a man's front yard on top of his house. The buildings consisted of barns, stable room for 12 or 15 horses, and a hut for an eating room for passengers. This latter had bunks in it for the station keeper and an ostler or two. You could rest your elbows on its eaves, and you had to bend in order to get in at the door. In place of a window, there was a square hole about large enough for a man to crawl through, but this had no glass in it. There was no flooring, but the ground was packed hard. There was no stove, but fireplace served all needful purposes. There were no shelves, no cupboards, no closets. In a corner stood an open sack of flour, and nestled against its base were a couple of black and venerable tin coffee pots, a tin teapot, a little bag of salt, and a side of bacon. These road stations were typically built every 12 to 15 miles along a route, since that was about the limit horses could go pulling wagons before needing to rest. The first real development in what was to become Fremont County were the gold mining towns of South Pass City, Atlantic City, and Miners Delight. Miners flooded into the area to strike it rich. The nearest railroad was about 100 miles south at Point of Rocks or Green River. Stages and freight wagons brought goods and people to the mining district, and stage stations ran from these spots to the South Pass area. Once at South Pass, most miners built their own crude cabins or slept in tents, but several hotels were built in each community to provide rooms and meals for miners who could afford to stay in a hotel. While crude and simple by modern standards, these early hotels were still a significant improvement on the stage stations. Relatively safe and sanitary, hotels were considered essential to a successful business community in a developing town. An ad for the South Pass Hotel, built in 1869, reads, quote, "The only first-class house in the city, commodious rooms, neatly and comfortably fitted with new furniture, table constantly supplied with game and all other available luxuries." Stagecoaches continuing the line of travel between the Union Pacific Railroad and South Pass arrive and depart from this house. The grandson of Janet Sherlock, who owned the hotel, remembered it was generally not busy, except when the rumor of a new gold strike happened. Then, all 9 rooms were filled. Transients, traveling ministers, and salesmen stayed in the hotel at various times. It was $1 a bed per night with an extra 50 cents for a meal. Only the somewhat larger bridal suite had a stove, so all the rooms were often cold. Guests remarked on waking up with ice on their blankets. The gold boom ended almost as quickly as it began at South Pass. There simply wasn't as much easily recovered gold as miners hoped. The boom towns quickly faded and most businesses closed. The Carpenter Hotel in Atlantic City hung on until the 1960s, as did the South Pass Hotel, serving the few miners still in the area, and other travelers who passed through. But most people from the area moved on to other boom towns or moved into the Lander Valley below to start a new community. The Lander Valley sat astride the freight road from the gold mining district at South Pass to the growing Army base at Fort Washakie to the north. All goods and supplies in and out of this part of Wyoming territory had to be freighted in from railheads at Green River or Point of Rocks, roughly 150 miles away, and the Army and the Indian Agency on the Shoshone Reservation, now called Wind River, needed a lot of supplies. Lander began as a small community serving the many freight wagon teams that came splashing across the river heading north or south. The first inn was built in 1874, where the Grand Theater currently stands. It was the former Lander Hotel, one of the first businesses on Lander's dusty main street. The hotel began as an eating place and a stopover for freight teams on their way to and from Fort Washakie. It was a 1-story, 4-room log building built by Ben Decora in 1874. Later, additions were built of adobe and wood. Civil War veteran Captain H.G. Nickerson bought the hotel in 1885. Behind the hotel, to the north, there was a livery stable and barn which Nickerson ran for the convenience of his guests. The Fremont Clipper newspaper reported it was a popular hostelry with large airy rooms, nice clean beds, and table always supplied with the best the market affords. It is very likely Lander helped inspire the American Western. a genre that has been a huge part of American culture for over 100 years. The hotel register shows that the author Owen Wister stayed at the Lander Hotel several times over the years on his trips to the Wind River Basin to hunt. The first time was in 1887. Wister was a lawyer and writer from Philadelphia, and his visits to Lander and Wyoming inspired him to write his novel The Virginian. The Virginian is considered the first Western. Another famous Western character that is associated with the Lander Hotel is Martha Jane Canary, also known as Calamity Jane. Her sister, Lena Canary Borner, lived north of Lander and for a time operated a small laundry near the Lander Hotel. Calamity Jane often stayed with her sister and would help her at the laundry. Calamity Jane also worked as a laundress at South Pass City during the gold boom and at Fort Washakie for the military. Lander Hotel was torn down in 1928 to make room for the stylish Spanish Mission-style Grand Theater. Built as a performance space for silent movies, it also hosted live theater, opera, vaudeville, and orchestra performances. The Lander Hotel was the first of many hotels that were built in Lander. In short order, the Bridge Hotel, the Capitol Hotel, the Albany Hotel, the Cottage Home Hotel, and others were built to serve the rapidly growing community. It may seem odd that this frontier town had multiple liveries, general stores, banks, and hotels, but at that time, Lander was the only town of any size for hundreds of miles in any direction. The gold boom towns were essentially abandoned. Riverton, Shoshone, and DuBois didn't exist. The other reason Lander grew rapidly and had as many businesses as it did was that it was the county seat in a much larger Fremont County. At that time, Fremont County encompassed both Hot Springs and Sublette counties, almost doubling its current size. People from the small towns of Thermopolis and Pinedale, and any farmers and ranchers in those areas, had to come to Lander to do government and legal business. It was often a several days' journey to and from Lander, so they needed a livery for their wagons and horses and a hotel to stay in while they did business in Lander. Another significant hotel that served Lander still stands at the corner of First and Main. William N. Coulter was born in Burlington, Iowa in 1849. As a young man, he headed west to California to join the gold rush, then came to the gold fields in Nevada. He came to the Lander Valley in 1884 and opened the OK Saloon. A few years later, he built a large frame building called Coulter's Hall at the corner of 3rd and Main. This building had an ice skating rink in the winter and a performance space called the Opera House where social and community events took place, as well as musical and dramatic performances. That building burned down, and Coulter got into the hotel business, building the brick Coulter block in 1907. As it was right across from the train depot, his hotel, called the Coulter House, did booming business. Meals were provided with the rooms, and for an extra 25 cents you could get a hot bath. Later, the building was known as the Wayne Hotel. Today, it is the Lander Bar Gannett Grill. A significant driver of the hotel and lodging boom in Lander was tourism. With the creation of Yellowstone and Eastern tourists wanting to experience the Wild West, Lander became a destination for out-of-state visitors who demanded good accommodations. Lander billed itself as the place, quote, where the rails ended and the trails began, and many of those trails led to the First National Park. Since it was the closest town to the south gate of Yellowstone, the towns of Jackson Hole and DuBois didn't exist at this time, visitors would arrive in Lander and then take stagecoaches north to the park. Lander businessmen like Eugene Amoretti owned the coaches and built a series of lodges on the way to Yellowstone, including one at Fort Washakie, the EA Ranch south of where DuBois is today, Brooks Lake Lodge on Togetee Pass, and a lodge at Jackson Lake. A very large and important building on Lander's Main Street was the Fremont Hotel, which served guests for 80 years on the corner of Main and 3rd from 1891 to 1971. Jerry Sheehan, who arrived from Denver in a one-horse cart in 1885, had the foresight to build an out-of-the-ordinary hotel in an isolated western town. Mr. Sheehan was no stranger to the hotel business. Prior to opening the Fremont Hotel, he was the proprietor of the Bridge Hotel just down the street. The Fremont started out as a brick 2-story structure with a lobby, office, dining room, and billiard hall on the first floor. On the second floor was a parlor with a balcony opening from it, 2 suites, and 13 single rooms. With the coming of the railroad in 1906, 2 more stories were added, making it the first 4-story building in Wyoming. The hotel was a well-known landmark to travelers who took a room at the hotel. Many of the town's events took place at the hotel. The balcony on the second story was a popular spot for politicians to give speeches to crowds assembled in the streets below. On a cold and snowy Wednesday, February 3, 1971, the worst fire in Landers history completely destroyed the historic Fremont Hotel, which stood where the modern one-story bank is today. At the time, there were about 30 guests registered at the hotel. All but one guest survived. Some were saved by student climbers from the National Outdoor Leadership School, who ran ropes to the upper stories and lowered people to safety. Another Lander hotel of note was the 3-story Noble Hotel. If you wanted a luxurious place to stay in 1919, this hotel at the corner of 3rd and Main was the place to check in. In addition to guest rooms, it housed a bar and restaurant, a bank, the Western Union office, other professional offices, and a drugstore. Many people still remember the large fish tanks in the lobby that held live trout. The idea for this hotel came from H.O. Barber. Barber was born in Ohio and came to Fremont County around 1906, working as a freight agent for the railroad. He opened a small coal mine in Hudson, which grew to a major mine, making him wealthy. Barber realized the tourism value of Landers' proximity to Yellowstone. He became the principal partner in the Noble Hotel. He convinced the Chicago Northwestern Railroad to assign Pullman cars to get wealthy tourists to Lander, where they would stay at his exclusive hotel, then take motor coaches to the park. Barber partnered with banker Frank Noble, who wanted the hotel named for his only son Everett, who died at a young age from appendicitis. The Noble rivaled hotels in Denver and Chicago. Costing over $200,000 in 1918, each room had a bathroom and a telephone. The main lobby had a marble floor, mahogany woodwork, ivory beams, and a stained glass skylight. The dining room sat 100 people and boasted white linen tablecloths and silver service. In 1929, Harold Del Monte, who had worked at the bank in the Noble, bought the hotel. He was an avid historian and wanted the hotel to give, quote, a brief but true synopsis of some of the exciting events of the early West as they influenced the town of Lander and the surrounding Wind River country. The rooms were decorated with Western themes like the Pony Express, Lewis and Clark, the Mountain Men, and others. Del Monte commissioned Montana painter J.K. Ralston to paint a series of paintings about the life of Chief Washakie, which hung in the hotel dining room. These paintings are now at the Lander Pioneer Museum. He also had Western-style furniture, Native American artifacts, a grand fireplace, mounted big game heads, and a huge aquarium filled with trout. In 1945, a writer said, quote, as you step inside, you are immediately in the spacious living room of a motion picture mountain lodge. The hotel closed in 1969 due to changing tastes and easier vehicle access to the national parks. The National Outdoor Leadership School moved into the empty hotel in 1975, and today it is a vibrant hub of activity. Knowles, as the group is known, trains people to explore and appreciate the wilderness. Knowles refurbished the building, keeping much of the original feel and decor. People still travel many of the historic routes through Wyoming, although they are now paved highways and the rough roadhouses and stage stops are gone. Today, the classic old Lander hotels are gone or have been repurposed. There are a number of motels developed to cater to the automobile traveling public and modern chain hotels that still serve tourists and travelers on their way to Yellowstone or to experience the Old West, echoes of which still exist in Fremont County. Even though the railroad stopped running in 1971, Lander is still known as the jumping-off point for trails into the Wind River Mountains, the Red Desert, and Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks. That's it for this episode of the Rediscover the Winds podcast. Next episode will focus on hotels and Du Bois as we continue with our theme of tourism and travel. Rediscover the Winds, a Wyoming history podcast, is brought to you in part by the Wind River Cultural Centers Foundation. The WRCCF is a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping Fremont County museums preserve our Wyoming and Wind River cultural and natural history by directly supporting the efforts of the Du Bois Museum, the Pioneer Museum in Lander, and the Riverton Museum. To learn more, Visit www.windriverccf.com and help us conserve our past while enriching our present. Thank you.